Waterlogged is a horror podcast and contains material not suitable for all audiences. Full content warnings can be found in the show notes. Listener discretion is advised.
Spring is his least favorite season to hike in. Summer is lovely. The early morning air is cooler than the heat of the day, and birdsong heralds every footstep. Blackberries grow on the side of the path, promising a tart mouthful of the season in every seed-filled bite. He loves hiking in the summer. Fall is beautiful too. Mushrooms wherever you step. An easy harvest for an experienced forager. The whole world the color of fire. The smell of autumn leaves in his nose, and the sound of them crunching under his boots. Winter is a stark, bare kind of beauty. Some days it takes a lot of work to find the loveliness in it. But when it snows, and the birch trees stand sentinel against the frozen lake, and the whole world looks cast in sugar, his heart aches with it, and he walks quickly to the rhythm of the cardinal's song. Spring is different. Late spring is all right, he supposes. When the flowers start to bloom and the forest greens. When the shoots are young enough to harvest. But early spring? Early spring in his woods is nothing but an exercise in the depth and thickness and staining quality of mud. Paths that stay sturdy in even the thickest of winter snowmelt become nothing but churning muck, studded with the remnants of cobblestones just daring you to turn an ankle if you try to walk above the wet. Early spring, March into April, is the time it's hardest for him to convince himself to get up and put his boots on for a walk. His boyfriend suggests, good-naturedly, that they invest in some waders or a hose if he hates getting mud on the floors so much, and he shrugs it off. A little dirt never hurt anyone, he steadfastly tells himself, no matter how deep it works into the crevices of his boots. The pools are the worst of it. They seem to pop up anywhere, with no regard for the presence of a creek or spring to feed from. Vernal pools, he knows, don't require such things. Rainwater is enough, and the incessant rains of early spring seem intent on placing them directly in the middle of the path, so he has to shimmy carefully around the edges to avoid going straight in. He knows they aren't very deep, but he'd hate to spend how many hours getting the muck out of his clothes if he slipped and fell. And, well, he's ashamed to admit this. His boyfriend would tease him to no end if he knew. He can just see the look on his face, struggling to hide a smile. Baby, seriously? Of all things? A frog? He hates frogs. He always has. When he was 3 or maybe 4, it's hard to remember, he'd found one in the creek out back of his house. As children do, he'd been delighted and attempted to grab it. The bullfrog, uninterested in becoming a toddler's snack, had leapt forward, landing directly on his face in one wet, cold, slimy cannonball. He had screamed, fallen backwards, knocked the back of his head on the rocks, and scraping his arm as he fell. The blood washed into the creek, bathing the frog in red as it swam away. A small incident, well over 20 years in the past, and one he might well have forgotten. But somewhere in his psyche, it had rooted. The blood, the pain, the frog, swimming away. He hadn't forgotten it. And even now, though the fear faded into childhood, the dislike remains. And vernal pools are teeming with frogs. He doesn't know what attracts them so. They're not full of food, not protected from predators. Hell, the water is barely water, just an inch or two of puddle and 6 inches of mud. But something about them seems to be an all-expenses-paid spa for his childhood terrors, in all their tiny, croaking glory. This spring, the pools are especially bad. He doesn't know what's different. The rain hasn't been worse than previous years, but there are twice as many as there were last year. After his whining reaches new heights, his boyfriend surprises him with a gift of a nice pair of waterproof boots, which is sweet of him, and earns him a kiss before he trumps out into the mud, sturdily shod and ready to face the world. There's a particular pool he hates. It completely covers the path, with no dry borders to edge his way along. He has no choice but to walk straight through. He squares his shoulders, takes a deep breath, and stomps forward, steadfastly not looking down to avoid seeing any small amphibian shapes scattering before his steps. That was his first mistake. If he had looked down, he might have seen the deep patch of mud. If he had looked down, he might have avoided landing in it up to the calf, and he might have even avoided falling face first into the pool in his efforts to wrench himself out. His bout of truly impressive swearing is cut off when his face makes contact with the water. Not, as may be expected, by the spluttering inherent in inhaling water and dead leaves, but by a sudden realization. He can hear something. A human voice, barely distinguishable between the peeping of the frogs. Any words inaudible, but clearly human. He lifts his head out of the water, trying to stifle his coughs, and the sound fades. He hauls himself up, pulling his leg from the mud with one last yank, and listens. But the sound is gone. He sits, spellbound, waiting for the sound to return, before the freezing water soaking into his clothes reminds him that he is sat in the middle of a fucking puddle, and the stains will never come out. With some effort, he gets up and trudges home, keeping one ear cocked for the strange sound. His boyfriend fusses to no end over the cold, and his clothes, of course. He insists he strips out of his wet things and has a hot shower to warm up. He obeys, without thinking too much about it. Eats the meal placed in front of him. He speaks only a little, and that when spoken to. Eventually, his boyfriend decides he's in one of his poetic moods, and leaves him to it, with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a mug of hot tea pressed into his hand. It's gone cold by the time his boyfriend coaxes him into bed, still untasted, eyes remaining locked on the woods outside their window. He recovers himself by the next morning a bit. He's still vacant, still prone to gazing off into space, but he apologizes to his boyfriend for his weird funk and eats the breakfast laid out for him with thanks. He can tell his boyfriend is worried. He hovers by the door, caught between staying and going. But he assures him he'll be fine. He'll stay in today, maybe tackle that stubborn cabinet that keeps sticking. His boyfriend is unsure, he knows, but with enough encouragement and reminders of how late for work he is, he goes. It is agony to wait. 5 minutes. 10. 20. Enough that he's definitely arrived at work, definitely hasn't forgotten anything, definitely hasn't changed his mind and decided to stay home today. Eventually, he's satisfied he's not coming back. The path to the pool is shorter than he remembered. Maybe it's because he no longer cares to avoid the mud puddles and splashes directly through the ponds. Maybe it's because he doesn't care about the water soaking into his slippers, so he's not walking with a care for his boots. It seems only minutes before he arrives at the pool. Bare footprints trace the edge. 3 sets, with elongated toes and webbed feet. He wonders vaguely why anyone would be out without shoes. It doesn't matter. The voice he heard is stronger now, and he falls to his knees at the water's edge, straining to make out a syllable, a word. There's nothing. For a moment, he despairs, and then memory strikes. He heard the voice when he was in the water. Maybe he has to go back in. Without hesitating, he lies down at the edge and dips his face into the pool. The water is cold and muddy, and a frog kicking past his face sends a lurch through his stomach. But the reward is immediate. The voice. He can't tell who it is, only that he knows them. That it's someone he loves and has been reunited with after all this time. He pushes down, trying to submerge himself, to get close enough to hear the words of comfort he knows they're saying. He can't see anything, but lips touch his own and he's lost in a sudden rush of ecstasy, and the man in the house at the edge of the woods behind him was forgotten in the complete conviction that this was truly love, and his heart swells until he thought he could die of the joy of it. He closes his eyes, feels a moist hand brush along his jawline to rest gently at the back of his neck. For a moment it reminds him of amphibian skin, but the revulsion that would normally accompany that association is overpowered by the force of his happiness. Then his eyes open, as the hand grips hard and yanks down. It bewilders the EMTs when they find him a day later. They shrug and scratch their heads and conclude he must have had a sudden stroke. How else could a healthy young man in the prime of his life drown in 2 inches of water?
Narcissus in the Mud was written by Daisy McNamara and performed by Amy Young. It was edited and sound designed by Daisy McNamara. It was produced by Astaguente and Daisy McNamara. Our theme song and the frog music were by Lou Sutcliffe. Follow us on social media at WaterloggedPod. Links are in the show notes. Waterlogged is a production of Eelsong Studios and Law of Names Media.